The rescue that changed everything. The sun was setting in the war-torn village, casting long shadows over the rubble-strewn streets. Stanley, a seasoned aid worker, moved steadily through the chaos, his heart heavy with the knowledge of the suffering surrounding him. The crackle of distant gunfire echoed in the background as he pushed forward, his thoughts focused solely on the task at hand, delivering medical supplies to those in need. His hands, calloused from years of service, gripped the worn leather straps of his bag, but his mind was elsewhere, constantly scanning for signs of anyone in need. He had learned long ago that in places like this, every second counted, and yet every life lost felt like a personal failure. As an aid worker, Stanley had seen it all, the horrors of war, the heartbreaking suffering. But none of it ever prepared him for what he was about to witness. Suddenly, the sound of a child's scream pierced the air, sharp and desperate. It was the kind of sound that stopped time, slicing through the haze of destruction. Without thinking, Stanley found himself running toward the sound, his feet moving faster than his thoughts. In war zones, such cries were often the result of tragedy, but something in this one, something primal, drove him forward with unwavering determination. Stanley rounded the corner of a crumbling building and stopped dead in his tracks. There, amidst the wreckage, lay a young boy, no older than 12. His body was twisted beneath a pile of debris, and blood trickled down the side of his face. His eyes were wide with pain and fear, yet there was something else in them, a kind of recognition. The boy's eyes locked with Stanley's, and in that brief, timeless moment, an unspoken bond was formed. Stanley's training kicked in, and without hesitation, he rushed forward. His breath came in short, controlled bursts as he surveyed the scene. The area was too dangerous, with debris shifting and the constant threat of nearby explosions, but Stanley couldn't turn away. The child needed him, and that was all that mattered. "Hold on, son," Stanley said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I'm going to get you out of here." With shaky hands, he began to clear the debris from the boy's small body, every movement calculated and precise. The boy, in his pain and terror, did not scream or struggle. Instead, he looked up at Stanley, his small fingers reaching for the aid worker's arm, a silent plea for help. In that moment, a bond was formed between them, a bond that would transcend time, distance, and even words. The explosions rumbled louder as Stanley gently lifted the boy, cradling him close to his chest. The boy's small fingers clung desperately to Stanley's shirt, a lifeline in a world that seemed to be falling apart around them. As they moved through the wreckage-strewn streets, Stanley's heart raced. Every step felt like a gamble. But there was no time to stop, no time to think. They had to get to safety, and fast. Despite the devastation around them, Stanley's mind remained focused on one thing: getting the boy to safety. As they neared the makeshift medical tent, Stanley felt a surge of hope. He had saved others before, but this felt different. The boy's life felt intertwined with his own in a way he couldn't quite explain. It was as though, in saving this child, Stanley was somehow saving himself as well. The medical team worked quickly to stabilize the boy's condition. Stanley remained by his side, his hands steady as he helped where he could. He watched with bated breath as the boy's vitals slowly stabilized, the color returning to his pale face. It was a small victory in a world filled with tragedy, but it was enough. The boy had survived, and Stanley knew that he had done everything in his power to ensure that survival. As the boy was finally taken into care, Stanley stood back, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and relief wash over him. He was no stranger to the emotional toll of his work, but there was something about this boy that made the experience feel different. In his eyes, Stanley had seen not just a victim of war, but a young life full of potential, a life that could still be shaped, still be saved. Stanley watched as the boy was taken away, his mind drifting to the countless faces he had encountered in his years as an aid worker. But this one, this young boy, would remain with him forever. He didn't know it at the time, But the day he saved Ethan's life would mark the beginning of a lifelong connection, a bond that would bring them together in ways neither could have imagined. Years later, Stanley would come to realize that the boy he had saved was not just a symbol of the suffering he had witnessed, but also of the profound impact one act of kindness could have on the future. It was a realization that would change everything, not just for Ethan, but for Stanley as well. A life shaped by compassion. Years passed, and the village that had once been a war zone began to fade from Ethan's memories. He could still recall the chaos, the terror, and the overwhelming darkness of that day. But it was the light, the unwavering light of a stranger's compassion, that stayed with him, tucked deep in the recesses of his heart. As Ethan grew older, the events of that day became a distant echo, though they never truly left him. He often thought of Stanley, the man who had saved his life. But over time, his thoughts turned toward the future and the pursuit of his own purpose. He had become a survivor, yes, but more than that, he had become a man with a mission. It was not long after that day in the war-torn village that Ethan began to chart his own course. The trauma of the experience had left him with more than just physical scars. It had planted the seed of something greater, an unshakable drive to help others, to heal those in need. Stanley's steady hands, his quiet strength, his refusal to leave the boy behind in the rubble, all became the foundation for Ethan's own journey into the medical field. But it wasn't easy. Every time Ethan faced the rigorous demands of medical school, the memories of that day in the debris-filled streets would surface. It was as though the physical and emotional scars of that moment were woven into the fabric of his being, pushing him forward even when he doubted himself. When times were toughest, when the weight of the academic world seemed too much to bear, Ethan would think of Stanley's face, his hand shaking as he worked to save a life. Stanley had shown him that compassion wasn't just about bandaging wounds. It was about seeing a person, truly seeing them. It was about understanding that every life mattered, no matter the circumstances. And so, in his pursuit of becoming a doctor, Ethan carried Stanley's lessons with him. Lessons that went beyond anatomy and medicine. Lessons that were written into the very marrow of his bones. By the time Ethan completed his medical training, he had become a highly respected neurologist. His reputation as a leader in his field had spread far and wide, with articles published in prestigious journals, and his name becoming synonymous with breakthrough treatments and revolutionary techniques. His success was nothing short of remarkable, but it was rooted in something deeper, something more profound than any medical accolade. It was rooted in the lesson that Stanley had unknowingly imparted to him all those years ago, the importance of healing not just the body, but the soul. Ethan's rise in the medical field wasn't driven by a desire for fame or fortune. No, his success had always been driven by a need to give back, to honor the man who had saved him all those years ago. He had built a life around the principles of compassion, empathy, and a steadfast dedication to making the world a better place. But as time went on, something began to stir inside him. The success, the accolades, the accomplishments, they all felt hollow. There was a lingering void, an unfulfilled part of him that longed for something more. That something more had a name: Stanley. Ethan had never forgotten the aid worker who had pulled him from the wreckage. He had tried to track Stanley down many times, but the trail always seemed to run cold. Aid workers came and went, but Stanley remained a figure from the past, a fleeting memory that he couldn't quite grasp. The only thing that had kept him going in his search was the knowledge that if he could just find Stanley, he could say thank you in person. It was during a rare break in his hectic schedule that Ethan made the decision to finally seek Stanley out once again. His search had taken him to countless records, to old aid rosters, and to websites filled with names he didn't recognize. But after years of searching, Ethan had finally found a lead. An old list of volunteers, one that included Stanley's name. With a surge of excitement, Ethan followed the trail, and just when he thought it was leading him nowhere, he found it. A return address, a familiar name. The letter Ethan wrote to Stanley was one of the most heartful things he had ever written. As the pen moved across the paper, his emotions spilled out in a cascade of words. He had to thank him. He had to let Stanley know how much that moment, that one act of kindness, had shaped his life. The letter, which began with the words, "Dear Mr. Stanley," went on to tell of Ethan's journey, of how he had become a doctor, and how not a day passed that he didn't think of the aid worker who had saved him. It was a letter filled with gratitude, with admiration, and with a deep, abiding connection that neither of them had realized at the time. Ethan hesitated before sending it. What if Stanley had forgotten him? What if all these years had passed and Stanley had moved on, leaving that chapter of his life behind? But Ethan knew, deep in his soul, that this was something he had to do. So, with a final, steady breath, he sealed the envelope and sent it. A week later, Stanley's reply arrived. Ethan's heart raced as he carefully tore open the letter. He could feel the weight of it, the years of distance, but also the promise of something more. As his eyes scanned the words, he felt a swell of emotion rise up inside him. Stanley remembered. Stanley hadn't forgotten him. In fact, Stanley's response was one of gratitude and humility. The letter was short, but it was enough. Stanley wrote that he remembered the boy from the village, the boy who had been saved from the wreckage, the boy whose life he had fought so hard to preserve. The letter was a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them, a bond that had been forged in the heat of war and had endured the passage of time. Stanley's words were simple, but they spoke volumes. "I've always remembered you, Ethan. You were the one who gave me hope that there was still good in this world." Ethan felt tears sting his eyes as he read those words. Hope. That was what Stanley had given him all those years ago. And now, all these years later, it was Ethan's turn to return the favor. The letter from Stanley had come at a turning point in Ethan's life. He had built a successful career, but something had been missing. The past, it seemed, had finally come full circle. Now he had the chance to repay the man who had saved him, and he was determined to do it. Ethan's letter had been simple, but it had sparked something in both of them, a connection that neither could have anticipated. As the days passed, the anticipation of finally meeting Stanley again began to build. Ethan knew that this meeting would be a turning point, not just in their lives, but in the legacy they would leave behind. When the day finally arrived, Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He drove to Stanley's house, the address that had been carefully written on the letter. He arrived at the doorstep, his mind racing with thoughts of what to say, how to explain the years that had passed, and what had brought him here. The doorbell rang, and Stanley opened the door. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he looked at the man who had changed his life. Stanley's hair was graying, his body frailer than the memory Ethan had held for so many years. But in his eyes, Ethan could see the same kindness, the same steadfast compassion that had carried him through the darkest days of war. "Ethan," Stanley said softly, his voice a little cracked but warm, "it's good to see you again." Ethan stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Stanley. Thank you for everything." The reunion. Ethan stood on the doorstep, unsure of what to do next. His mind raced, trying to find the right words to say. For 20 years, he had carried the memory of that day, the dust, the blood, the quiet connection between a terrified child and the man who had saved him. But now, here he was, standing in front of Stanley, the very man who had pulled him from the wreckage, and all those years of anticipation, of gratitude, seemed to freeze in time. Stanley's hand trembled slightly as he reached out to welcome Ethan into his home. The lines on his face were deep, more pronounced than Ethan remembered, and there was a certain weariness about him that had not been there when they first met. Time had carved its toll on the man who had been a beacon of strength all those years ago, and yet there was still something unmistakable in Stanley's eyes, a quiet, enduring resolve that seemed to hold the world at bay. "Come in, Ethan," Stanley said, his voice rich with warmth. It was the same voice that had promised safety all those years ago. And in that moment, Ethan felt something stir deep within him. He followed Stanley inside, stepping into a living room that seemed suspended in time. The furniture, though old and worn, exuded a kind of lived-in comfort. Family photographs adorned the walls, telling silent stories of a life well lived, a life full of love and loss. Ethan's gaze lingered on one particular photo, a black and white picture of a young couple standing together, their smiles captured mid-laughter. Stanley and Anne, no doubt. The woman who had shared his life, his dreams, and his work in those dangerous corners of the world. There was a certain peacefulness in the photo, a reminder of happier days before the pain of loss had taken its toll. Stanley moved toward the kitchen, gesturing for Ethan to sit. "Can I offer you some tea?" he asked, his voice steady but tired. Ethan nodded, gratefully sinking into a worn armchair by the window. As Stanley bustled around the kitchen, Ethan's mind wandered, reflecting on the years that had passed since that fateful day in the village. He thought about his journey from a frightened child, clinging to the man who had saved him, to the accomplished doctor he had become. He had spent so many years wondering what Stanley had been like, who he had become after that moment. And now, finally, the reunion was happening. But it was different than he had imagined. Time had changed them both in ways that were hard to comprehend. Stanley returned with a steaming cup of tea, placing it gently on the table beside Ethan before sitting down in the chair across from him. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, and Ethan could feel the weight of the past pressing down on both of them. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. There was so much to say, but where to start? "You know," Stanley said softly, breaking the silence, "I've thought about you a lot over the years, wondered what happened to you, if you made it through. I never knew if I did enough for you." Ethan looked up at him, his heart swelling with emotion. "You did more than enough," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "You saved my life. That's not something I can ever repay. Not really." Stanley gave a small, almost wistful smile. "I was just doing my job, Ethan. Helping was what I was trained to do. But you stuck with me. You kept me going through the worst of it. You gave me hope." The weight of those words hung in the air between them. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight with the force of his emotion. All those years of searching, of trying to find the right way to express his thanks, felt like they had led him to this moment, a moment that was both simpler and more profound than he could have imagined. "I never forgot what you did for me," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never stopped thinking about you, Stanley. About that day. I became a doctor because of you. You showed me what it meant to really help people, to save lives. You gave me a reason to believe that I could make a difference." Stanley's eyes softened, and he looked down at his hands, which had once been so steady and strong but now seemed fragile and worn. He sighed deeply, as though carrying the weight of his own past and the memories of those he had helped, including Ethan. "That day changed me too," Stanley said, his voice far away. "I didn't know it then, but it was the start of something I hadn't expected. Helping people, saving lives, it was always my calling. But after that day, after you, I realized there was more to it. There was a connection, a bond that went beyond just the work." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding now what Stanley was trying to express. They had both been changed by that moment, in ways neither had fully comprehended at the time. But now, with the passage of years and the quiet stillness of the room between them, that bond seemed to grow stronger. It was as though their lives had intertwined in some cosmic way, leading them back to this point, where they could reconnect and finally share the unspoken gratitude that had lived in their hearts all these years. The conversation shifted as they began to talk about their lives. Stanley spoke of his years as an aid worker, of the places he had visited, and the people he had helped. There was a certain melancholy in his voice as he recounted the losses, both personal and professional, that he had endured over the years. But he spoke with a quiet pride, knowing that the work he had done had made a difference, even if it had come at a great cost. Ethan, in turn, shared his own journey, the long hours of medical school, the grueling residency, and the breakthroughs he had made as a neurologist. He told Stanley about his work with patients, the joy of helping people heal, and the challenges that came with the responsibility of holding someone's life in his hands. But he also spoke of the loneliness that had crept into his life, despite his professional success. The emptiness that had followed him through the years, always just beneath the surface, like a quiet ache he couldn't shake. "I thought I had it all figured out," Ethan admitted, looking down at his hands. "But something was always missing. There was this piece of me that wasn't whole. I've been successful, yes, but I've never been able to let go of what you did for me. I guess that's why I came back. I had to see you again. Had to thank you." Stanley's eyes softened, his hands resting on the arms of his chair. "I never thought I'd be here, in this quiet house, so many years after everything. I thought I'd be out there still, working in the field, helping those who needed it. But life has its own way of changing things." The conversation lulled for a moment, both men lost in their thoughts, reflecting on the passage of time. But then Stanley spoke again, his voice quiet but resolute. "You're right, Ethan. Life doesn't always go the way we expect, but it has a way of bringing us full circle. And now, here you are, a successful doctor. You've made a life for yourself, but I can see it in your eyes. You're still carrying something you haven't been able to put down." Ethan met Stanley's gaze, surprised by the clarity in his words. He had never shared the deeper, more personal struggles he had faced with anyone, not even his closest friends. But in that moment, sitting across from the man who had saved his life, Ethan felt a deep sense of understanding. Stanley knew. He understood what it meant to carry the weight of the past, to struggle with the burden of what had been lost. "I've been thinking about you too," Stanley continued, his voice gentle. "And I've been wondering if there's something I can do for you now. Maybe you think you owe me something, but it's not about repayment. It's about connection. We've both been through a lot, and sometimes helping one another is the only way forward." Ethan felt the truth of Stanley's words deep in his chest. It was not about paying back the past, not about trying to make everything right. It was about the shared bond they had formed, a bond of mutual respect, gratitude, and love. It was about healing, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. "I don't know how to thank you," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I don't think I ever will." Stanley smiled softly, the lines on his face softening as he looked at Ethan with a tenderness that spoke volumes. "You don't have to. Just be the man you've become. That's more than enough." In that moment, time seemed to stand still. The years that had separated them fell away, and all that remained was the quiet understanding between two men who had experienced the most profound form of connection, one forged not by blood, but by shared humanity. And as the afternoon faded into evening, the two men sat together in the quiet of Stanley's home, knowing that this reunion, this moment of healing, was just the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives, bridging the gap of years. The next few days passed in a quiet stillness. Ethan stayed with Stanley, taking the time to reconnect, to sit with him in the living room and talk about life in a way that neither had done in years. It was as if all the distance, both physical and emotional, between them had finally collapsed into a space where words and silences could coexist comfortably. The air between them was not filled with awkwardness, but with understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement that, after 20 years, they had both changed, but they were still the same in the most important ways. Stanley had once been a figure of unstoppable strength, a man whose resilience had carried him through countless difficult situations. He had lived through war, loss, and despair, and had always come out the other side stronger, determined to continue his work in aid and humanitarian efforts. But now, as Ethan looked at him, he saw that the strength had faded. The fire that had once burned so brightly within Stanley's heart had dimmed with age and the weight of grief, yet it was not gone. Ethan could see traces of it, shining faintly through the fog of Stanley's quiet sorrow. Every conversation, every shared moment, felt like a step toward something more. They spoke about their lives in the years that had passed since their first meeting. Stanley talked about the missions he had led, the people he had helped, and the quiet satisfaction that came from doing work that made a difference in the world. He spoke of his late wife, Anne, with a reverence and love that filled the room with a palpable sense of loss. Anne had been his partner, both in life and in their shared work. She had been the anchor that kept him grounded, the person who gave him the courage to keep going when everything around them seemed to fall apart. But now, Anne was gone, and Stanley was left to navigate a world without her. I used to believe that if I helped enough people, if I made enough of a difference, then maybe I'd find peace with myself, Stanley said one evening as they sat together by the fire. The crackling flames filled the room with warmth, and Ethan could see the deep weariness in Stanley's face. But after Anne died, I don't know. I started to wonder if it was all worth it. Was I really helping people, or was I just running away from my own pain? Ethan could hear the cracks in Stanley's voice, the weight of years of unspoken grief that had accumulated inside him. He felt a pang of sympathy for the man who had saved him all those years ago, but he knew better than to offer empty words of comfort. Stanley didn't need reassurance. He needed something more, a way to confront the loss that had shaped his life. I understand, Ethan replied quietly. I've been there. After that day in the village, I'd always thought that I needed to become someone, that I needed to be a doctor because that was what you made me believe. But as I got older, I realized that becoming a doctor wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to just heal people. I needed to heal myself too. Stanley turned his head to look at Ethan, his eyes searching. There was a moment of silence before Stanley spoke again. What do you mean? What are you really saying, Ethan? I'm saying that I spent my life running too, Ethan said, his voice steady. I thought that becoming successful, that achieving something would fill the emptiness I've been carrying. But it doesn't. Success doesn't heal you. At some point, you have to face what you've lost, what's been broken inside you. And you have to let yourself feel that pain, because only then can you start to heal. Stanley's gaze softened. For the first time since their reunion, he seemed to understand. I don't know if I can do that, he whispered. I don't know if I can go back and face all the mistakes I've made, all the things I couldn't change. I've spent my life thinking that if I just kept helping others, I could outrun the guilt. But it doesn't work that way, does it? No, it doesn't, Ethan said, his voice filled with compassion. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe it's about accepting that we can't fix everything. And that's okay. What matters is that we try. We help the people we can, and we accept that some things are beyond our control. But we don't give up on ourselves in the process. There was a long silence as Stanley absorbed Ethan's words. His weathered hands rested on his lap, his fingers tapping absent-mindedly on the arm of his chair. Ethan watched him closely, recognizing the internal battle taking place within Stanley. It was the same kind of battle that Ethan had faced himself. Accepting the loss, confronting the unresolved grief, and understanding that healing was not just about physical recovery, but emotional and mental recovery too. The days that followed were filled with small moments of progress. Stanley agreed to go with Ethan to see a counselor, a small step, but an important one. He agreed to talk more openly about Anne, about the pain of losing her, and about his own fears and regrets. It wasn't easy. There were times when Stanley would retreat into himself, his old defenses rising up to shield him from the rawness of his emotions. But Ethan was patient, giving him space when he needed it, and offering support when Stanley was ready to open up. Through it all, Ethan realized that his role had shifted. No longer was he the boy who had been saved. Now, he was the one offering the kind of care and compassion that Stanley had shown him all those years ago. He had come full circle, but this time, it wasn't about saving a life. It was about helping a man rediscover his own worth, to remind him that even in the face of overwhelming loss, there was still hope. Hope that could be found in the smallest acts of kindness, in the quiet moments of shared understanding. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, Stanley spoke up again, his voice more reflective than before. "You know, I've always thought of myself as a caregiver," he said slowly, his fingers gently stroking the leaves of the plants around him. "But I've never really let anyone care for me. I've always believed that if I just kept giving, I could make up for all the things I didn't do right. But I think I'm finally starting to understand what it means to accept care, to allow myself to be helped." Ethan smiled, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about fixing everything. It was about acceptance, about learning to trust others, and, more importantly, learning to trust himself again. The change in Stanley was subtle, but it was there. He was still the same man who had braved the worst of humanity to help those in need. But now he was allowing himself to heal. He was allowing himself to feel the pain of his losses, and in doing so, he was beginning to rediscover his purpose. For Ethan, these days spent with Stanley were a revelation. He had come to repay a debt, to say thank you. But in the process, he found that the greatest gift he could offer Stanley was not a thank you at all. It was his presence. It was being there, in the quiet moments, offering nothing but understanding and support. And so the bond that had been forged so many years ago continued to grow, not as a debt to be repaid, but as a deep connection between two souls who had both been through the fires of life and had come out the other side, a little scared, but stronger for it. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the garden, Ethan turned to Stanley. "You know, we never really talked about what happens next," he said quietly, unsure if Stanley was ready for the conversation. Stanley looked up, his eyes thoughtful. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what happens when you're ready to move forward? What do you want to do with the rest of your life?" Ethan asked gently. "You've spent so much time helping others. But now, it's about you. It's about finding a new purpose, something that brings you peace." Stanley sat silently for a long time, his eyes distant as he pondered the question. "I think," he said at last, his voice tinged with uncertainty, but also a newfound resolve, "I think I want to see Anne's dream through. I want to finish what we started, the work we began together. But this time, I won't be alone. I'll have you, Ethan. And maybe that's what it was always supposed to be about. Not just helping people, but doing it together." Ethan's heart swelled with emotion. He had come to repay a debt, but now he realized that the true gift was not just the chance to give back. It was the chance to build something lasting, something that would honor both Stanley and Anne's legacy. And together, they would do it. They would make Anne's dream a reality, building something that would carry their work forward, helping others long after they were gone. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the garden, Ethan and Stanley sat side by side, knowing that their journey was far from over. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges, but for the first time in a long time, they faced it together, ready to take the next step forward. And in that moment, they both understood something that had eluded them for years. The true meaning of healing is not in what we do for others, but in what we allow others to do for us. The promise of tomorrow. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in Stanley's house began to shift. The quiet that had once hung heavy in the air, the weight of solitude and sorrow, gradually transformed into a new kind of peace. It was not the kind of peace that erased the past or made the pain disappear, but a peace born from acceptance, a peace that allowed room for both grief and hope. Stanley, with Ethan's gentle guidance, had started to confront the parts of himself he had long buried. He had learned that it was okay to be vulnerable, to allow others to care for him, and most importantly, to forgive himself for the things he could not control. Ethan, too, had begun to change. The man who had once viewed success as the measure of his worth now understood that fulfillment came from something much deeper. It wasn't in the accolades, the achievements, or the recognition. It was in the relationships, in the quiet moments of shared understanding and connection. Ethan had found, in Stanley, a kindred spirit, a man whose journey mirrored his own in many ways. Both had spent years running from their pain, but now they were learning to face it together. And it was this shared understanding that began to shape their future. Stanley had always wanted to honor Anne's legacy, the work they had begun together, their dream of creating a place where people could heal, rebuild, and start anew. For years, Stanley had put off completing their vision, too overwhelmed by loss and the demands of humanitarian work. But now, with the support of Ethan and the knowledge that he didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone, Stanley felt ready to move forward. It started with a simple conversation one evening. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the backyard. Ethan was sitting at the edge of the garden, his mind occupied with thoughts of his work at the hospital, when Stanley came outside and sat beside him. They both looked out at the peaceful scene before them, the distant sound of birds chirping and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. "You know," Stanley began, his voice thoughtful, "Anne always said that it wasn't enough to just treat the symptoms. It wasn't enough to simply fix what was broken. She believed in creating something bigger, a place where people could heal in every sense of the word. Not just physically, but emotionally and mentally too." Ethan nodded slowly, knowing exactly what Stanley meant. He had seen it in his own practice. Healing didn't just happen in the operating room or in the hospital beds. It happened in the spaces between the procedures, in the quiet moments of care, in the compassion shown by the people who helped guide others through their pain. He had seen it in Stanley, and he had seen it in himself. "I remember Anne's vision so clearly," Stanley continued, his voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. "She wanted a place where people could find more than just medical help. She wanted a community, a sanctuary where families who had been torn apart could come together again, where survivors could heal, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually too." Ethan turned to Stanley, sensing where this conversation was going. "And you want to make that vision a reality, don't you?" he asked, his voice soft. Stanley paused for a moment, his eyes distant, as if he were reaching back into the past to find the strength he once had. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think it's time to finish what we started. For Anne, for the people we were trying to help, and for me." Ethan felt a surge of emotion at Stanley's words. He had come to understand the weight of Stanley's grief, the years of carrying both the loss of his wife and the burden of their unfinished work. But now, with this new understanding, with this new partnership, they could move forward, together. "I'll help you, Stanley," Ethan said firmly, his voice full of conviction. "We'll do it together. We'll finish it. Anne's dream. Your dream." For a long time, Stanley was silent, as if weighing the enormity of what they were proposing. He had spent so many years working alone, driven by a sense of responsibility that often felt like a burden. But now, with Ethan by his side, the weight seemed just a little bit lighter. The idea of creating something that would not only honor Anne, but also serve a greater good. It was no longer just a dream. It was a future that was within their grasp. "I've spent a lot of time trying to heal the world, Ethan," Stanley said quietly. "But I've never really focused on healing myself. Maybe this is what I need. Maybe helping others isn't just about giving everything I have, but also about finding peace in doing so." Ethan looked at him, his eyes filled with understanding. "I think you're right," he said. "And you don't have to do it alone anymore. We're in this together." As the days turned into weeks, they began to make plans. They reached out to their networks, contacted aid organizations, and began to secure funding for the project. Ethan used his influence in the medical field to garner support, and Stanley drew on his years of experience and his unwavering passion for humanitarian work. They began to lay the groundwork for the center, a place where people could come to heal, to rebuild their lives, and to find hope. But even as they worked toward this grand vision, there were moments of doubt. Stanley still struggled with the weight of his past, the loss of Anne, and the feeling that perhaps he didn't deserve to see this dream come to life. There were days when he withdrew, when the old feelings of guilt and regret crept back in, threatening to overwhelm him. But each time that happened, Ethan was there, quietly supportive, offering a steady hand, reminding him of the progress they had made, and of the people they had already helped along the way. "Sometimes I wonder if I can really make a difference anymore," Stanley confessed one evening, his voice heavy with doubt. They were sitting in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the floor. "I've been at this for so long, and I still haven't fixed everything. There's always more to be done, more people to help, more lives to save. But what if it's never enough?" Ethan, who had spent years facing the same doubts, leaned forward, his gaze steady. "It's never about doing it all, Stanley. It's about doing what we can, with what we have, and doing it with the best of intentions. What you've already done, what we've already done, is enough. We're not meant to fix everything. We're just meant to try, and that's more than enough." Stanley looked at him, his expression softening. "You're right," he said, though his voice was still tinged with uncertainty. "Maybe that's what I need to accept. I can't do it all, but I can do something, and that has to count for something." As the weeks turned into months, their vision began to take shape. They secured the land for the center, and construction began. The process was slow, filled with obstacles and setbacks, but it felt like the world was finally aligning. Every brick laid, every wall built, was a step toward fulfilling Anne's dream, a dream that had once seemed impossible but now felt tangible. Stanley watched with a sense of pride as the center slowly took form. It wasn't just a building. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It was a symbol of love, loss, and hope, and it would serve as a place where people could find healing, just as he had found healing through his work and his partnership with Ethan. But there was still much to be done. And despite the progress, Stanley still found himself wrestling with his past, with the memories of Anne and the years spent alone. There were moments when he felt that old darkness creeping in, threatening to consume him once more. But each time, Ethan was there, a steady presence, reminding him that they were in this together, that they were building something not just for Anne, but for everyone who needed it. One evening, as they stood together on the construction site, looking out at the structure taking shape before them, Stanley turned to Ethan. "Do you think we're really doing this?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. "Do you think we can actually make it happen?" Ethan smiled, a warmth spreading through him at the sight of Stanley's tentative hope. "I know we can," he said, his voice full of conviction. "We're already making it happen." And in that moment, Stanley realized that for the first time in years, he felt at peace. It wasn't about completing the project. It wasn't about getting everything perfect. It was about knowing that they were on the right path, that together they were building something that would change lives. As the final touches were added to the center, Stanley and Ethan knew that their work was far from over, but they also knew that they had come a long way. Together, the dream that had once seemed impossible was now a reality. And as the center opened its doors to the first patients, Stanley felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. He had honored Anne's memory, completed their shared vision, and found peace within himself. They had done it, together. And the future was brighter for it. The legacy takes root. The grand opening of the Humanitarian Center was a day unlike any other. The sun rose early, casting a golden glow over the newly finished building. Its walls gleamed in the morning light, standing tall and proud as a testament to years of hard work, sacrifice, and a shared vision. The center wasn't just a building, it was a promise to offer hope to those who needed it most, to provide a place where healing could happen in every sense of the word. Ethan arrived at the site early, overseeing the final preparations. Volunteers bustled about, setting up tables, arranging chairs, and preparing food for the attendees. There was an air of excitement, a buzz of anticipation that seemed to infect everyone present. Ethan took a moment to stand back and look at the building, its sleek, modern design a perfect blend of form and function. It was everything Stanley and Anne had envisioned. and more. Stanley arrived shortly after, escorted by Maya, his daughter. His steps were slower now, his age showing in the careful way he moved, but his face carried an expression of pride that Ethan hadn't seen before. He paused at the entrance, taking in the sight of the building that had grown from Anne's dream into reality. His hand rested lightly on Maya's arm for support, and his eyes glistened with emotion. "It's beautiful," Stanley said softly, his voice almost drowned out by the morning breeze. "Anne would have loved this. She would have been proud of you," Maya replied, her own voice thick with emotion. "Of both of you." Ethan stepped forward, offering Stanley a steadying hand as they made their way to the entrance. The crowd gathered around them, volunteers, donors, and community members who had come to celebrate this milestone. There were smiles, laughter, and even a few tears as people greeted Stanley with warmth and admiration. Inside the center, the atmosphere was buzzing with life. The medical wing was pristine, its state-of-the-art equipment ready to serve its first patients. The classrooms in the education wing were brightly lit, filled with desks and learning materials. The community area, a large open space designed for gatherings and support groups, was already bustling with conversations and introductions. As they toured the facility, Stanley moved slowly, taking it all in. Each step brought him closer to the culmination of a journey that had begun decades ago. He stopped at the entrance to the medical wing, his hand brushing against the smooth surface of the wall. "I never thought I'd see this," he admitted quietly, turning to Ethan. "Not like this. It's more than I ever imagined." Ethan smiled, his own pride evident in the way he stood. "We couldn't have done it without you, Stanley. This place, it's as much yours as it is Anne's." Stanley nodded, his throat too tight with emotion to speak. He looked around, taking in the faces of the people who had come to witness this moment. Some were old friends from his days in humanitarian work. Others were new supporters who had been inspired by the story of the center. And then there were the families, the people who would benefit from the work being done here. Seeing their faces, filled with hope and gratitude, brought a sense of fulfillment that Stanley hadn't felt in years. As the tour ended, the crowd gathered in the central courtyard for the opening ceremony. A stage had been set up, adorned with flowers and banners bearing the center's name, the Ann Walker Humanitarian Center. The name gleamed proudly in the sunlight, a tribute to the woman whose vision had started it all. Stanley was the first to speak. As he stood at the podium, his hands gripping its edges for support, the crowd fell silent. He looked out at the faces before him, his heart full of gratitude and humility. "This center," Stanley began, his voice steady but full of emotion, "is more than just a building. It's a symbol of what can happen when people come together with a shared purpose. It's a place where hope can take root, where lives can be rebuilt, and where dreams can be realized." He paused, taking a deep breath as he continued. Anne believed in this vision with all her heart. She believed that healing wasn't just about medicine. It was about connection, about community, about giving people the tools they need to rebuild their lives. And today, we honor her legacy by opening these doors to all who need them. The crowd erupted in applause, the sound echoing across the courtyard. Stanley stepped back, his hands shaking slightly as he made his way off the stage. Ethan caught him, steadying him as they shared a quiet moment of mutual pride. "You did it, Stanley," Ethan said softly. "You brought her dream to life." Stanley nodded, his eyes misty. "We did it, Ethan. Together." The rest of the day was filled with joy and celebration. Families explored the center, children laughed as they ran through the hallways, and volunteers shared stories of their work. Ethan and Stanley moved through the crowd, greeting people, answering questions, and basking in the warmth of the community they had helped create. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the center, Stanley and Ethan found themselves sitting together on a bench outside. The day had been long, but the sense of accomplishment was overwhelming. Stanley leaned back, his hands resting on his lap as he looked out at the building that now stood as a beacon of hope. "You know, Stanley said after a long silence. I used to think that my time had passed, that I'd done all I could, and it wasn't enough. But seeing this, seeing what we've built, I think maybe I was wrong. Ethan smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It's never too late, Stanley. You've done more than enough. And this center, it's just the beginning. Stanley turned to him, a faint smile playing on his lips. I'm proud of you, Ethan. Of the man you've become. You've taken what happened to you and turned it into something incredible. That's not easy to do. Ethan looked at him, his expression filled with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you. You showed me what it means to care, to really care. And I'll never forget that. They sat together in comfortable silence, the sounds of the celebration drifting around them. The center had opened its doors, but its true work was just beginning. And as they watched the sky darken and the stars begin to appear, they knew that this was more than a victory. It was a new chapter. A chapter where their lives, and the lives of countless others, would be forever changed. For Stanley, it was a chance to honor Anne's memory and find peace within himself. For Ethan, it was an opportunity to carry forward the legacy of the man who had saved his life. Together, they had created something that would stand the test of time, a legacy of compassion, resilience, and hope. And in that moment, as the first stars began to twinkle in the night sky, they knew that the promise of tomorrow was brighter than ever. A future built on hope. Months passed, and the Ann Walker Humanitarian Center became a thriving hub of activity. Its doors, which had opened with such promise, now welcomed families, individuals, and entire communities seeking help, healing, and hope. The sound of children laughing echoed through the halls of the education wing, while quiet conversations filled the medical ward as doctors and nurses provided life-saving care. For Stanley, watching the center come to life was like watching a seed he had planted years ago finally bloom into something beautiful. Every time he visited, he saw proof of what could be achieved when compassion and resilience came together. And though his health continued to decline, each visit seemed to infuse him with a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that his and Anne's legacy would endure far beyond their lifetimes. A visit from the past. One particularly busy morning, Ethan was in the medical wing, reviewing patient files and coordinating with the center's new medical director. The work was relentless but fulfilling. Ethan had taken on a dual role as both the center's medical consultant and a neurologist providing specialized care. Every day, he saw lives changed by the work they were doing. Patients regaining mobility, children overcoming trauma, families finding new opportunities. As he finished reviewing the case, he noticed Stanley entering the ward, accompanied by Maya. Though frailer than before, Stanley's eyes sparkled with pride as he took in the bustling activity around him. I see you've been keeping busy, Stanley said, his voice warm as he approached Ethan. Ethan smiled, setting down the files. Busy is an understatement. This place has taken on a life of its own, but that's a good thing. Maya gave Ethan a knowing look. He insisted on coming today. He says he has something important to do. Stanley chuckled softly, his hands clasped tightly together. I might be slowing down, but I still have a few things left to accomplish. Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What's on your mind, Stanley? Stanley motioned for Ethan and Maya to follow him. They walked together toward the community wing, where support groups were meeting and vocational training sessions were underway. Stanley stopped in front of a bulletin board filled with photographs, testimonials, and thank you letters from people whose lives had been touched by the center. I wanted to show you something, Stanley said, pointing to the board. His hand trembled slightly, but his voice was steady. Look at these stories. These people aren't just surviving. They're thriving. They've found hope here. Ethan and Maya scanned the board, their eyes lingering on the handwritten letters and smiling faces captured in photographs. One letter, written in neat cursive, stood out to Ethan. It was from a young woman who had come to the center after losing her home in a natural disaster. She wrote about how the center had given her a chance to rebuild, to find purpose again. "She could have been me," Ethan said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "Lost, scared, searching for someone to help." Stanley nodded, his gaze unwavering. "That's why this place exists. For people like her. For people like you." An unexpected turn. As the day wore on, Ethan found himself reflecting on the immense impact the center had already had. But as much as the work fulfilled him, he couldn't ignore the growing concerns about Stanley's health. His mentor and friend had always been a pillar of strength, but now that strength was waning. Later that evening, Ethan found Maya sitting on a bench in the garden behind the center. The air was cool, and the sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink from the setting sun. Maya seemed deep in thought, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Penny for your thoughts?" Ethan asked, sitting down beside her. Maya gave him a small smile, though her eyes betrayed her worry. "It's Dad," she admitted. "He's been pushing himself too hard. He won't admit it, but I can see it." Ethan nodded, his own concerns mirroring hers. "I've noticed it too. But you know Stanley. He's as stubborn as they come." Maya sighed. "I just don't want him to feel like he has to carry this alone. He's done so much, and he deserves to rest, to enjoy what he's built here." Ethan reached out, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "He knows he doesn't have to do it alone anymore. That's why we're here, for him, for the center, for each other." Maya looked at him, her expression softening. "You've done so much for him, Ethan, for all of us. I don't know if I've ever really said it, but thank you." Ethan smiled, a warmth spreading through him. "You don't have to thank me, Maya. This isn't just about repaying a debt. It's about being part of something bigger, something that matters." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the weight of their shared responsibilities seemed to lift. In the quiet of the garden, surrounded by the flourishing plants and the gentle hum of activity from the center, they found solace in each other's presence. A celebration of legacy. A few weeks later, the center held its first anniversary celebration. The event was a lively affair, with food, music, and speeches from those whose lives had been transformed by the center. Families gathered in the courtyard, children played in the gardens, and the air was filled with laughter and joy. Stanley, though weaker than ever, attended the celebration, seated in a place of honor near the stage. Maya stayed close to him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder as he watched the festivities unfold. Ethan, as always, was nearby, ensuring everything ran smoothly. When it came time for the speeches, Stanley insisted on speaking, despite his frailty. With Ethan and Maya supporting him, he made his way to the podium. The crowd fell silent, their attention fixed on the man who had been the heart and soul of the center. "Today," Stanley began, his voice steady despite his exhaustion, "we celebrate not just this center, but the people who have made it what it is. This place was built on the idea that no one is beyond help, that no one is truly alone. It's a place where hope is rekindled, where lives are rebuilt, and where dreams are born again." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "I may not have much time left," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But I know that this center will outlive me. It will continue to help people long after I'm gone. And that's all I could ever hope for." Tears welled in the eyes of many in the audience, including Ethan and Maya. As Stanley finished his speech, the crowd erupted into applause, a standing ovation that echoed across the courtyard. The final gift. As the celebration wound down, Stanley pulled Ethan aside. They stood together in a quiet corner of the garden, the sounds of the event fading into the background. "I want to give you something," Stanley said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small worn notebook, its edges frayed from years of use. Ethan took the notebook, his brow furrowing in curiosity. "What's this?" "It's Anne's," Stanley said simply. "Her original notes for the center. All her ideas, her sketches, her dreams. They're in there. I want you to have it, to carry it forward." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat as he held the notebook. "Stanley, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Stanley replied, a faint smile on his lips. "Just promise me you'll keep building, keep helping, keep believing." Ethan nodded, his grip on the notebook tightening. "I promise." The legacy lives on. When Stanley passed away peacefully in his sleep a few months later, it was a loss felt deeply by everyone who had known him. The center held a memorial service in his honor, attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched. Maya and Ethan stood together, united in their grief, but also in their determination to carry forward the legacy Stanley and Anne had built. Over the years, the Anne Walker Humanitarian Center grew. Additional wings were added, new programs were developed, and similar centers were built in other communities, spreading the impact far and wide. Ethan and Maya became the heart of the operation, their bond strengthening as they worked together to ensure the center remained true to its mission. And through it all, Stanley's spirit remained. His name was etched not only on the walls of the center, but also in the hearts of everyone who passed through its doors. His legacy was not just a building or a program. It was a reminder of the power of compassion, the importance of connection, and the enduring strength of hope. In the years to come, every child who learned to read, every patient who found healing, and every family who rebuilt their lives owed a debt to Stanley and Anne, and to the bond that had brought Ethan and Stanley together all those years ago. The center stood as a testament to what could be achieved when people came together for a common purpose, and as Ethan walked its halls, the worn notebook in his pocket, he knew that they had built something truly extraordinary, a future filled with hope for everyone who needed it, a legacy eternal. The morning after Stanley's passing, the Anne Walker Humanitarian Center was quieter than usual. The staff moved softly through the halls, their usual cheerful chatter replaced with a respectful hush. Everyone felt the weight of the loss. A man who had given his life to service, who had been the foundation of the center's vision, was gone. Ethan stood in Stanley's office, which had remained untouched since his last visit. The room was modest, with only a few personal mementos scattered on the desk and shelves. A small globe sat in the corner, its surface dotted with red pins, marking the places Stanley had visited during his years of aid work. Ethan ran his fingers across its surface, tracing the journey of a man who had dedicated himself to the world's most vulnerable. His gaze shifted to the desk, where Stanley's framed photo of Anne rested. Her smiling face seemed to look out over the room, her presence as vital to the center as Stanley's had been. Next to the photo was the notebook Stanley had given Ethan, the same notebook Anne had used to sketch the earliest plans for what would become the Humanitarian Center. Ethan picked it up, flipping through its pages. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, each line filled with ideas and aspirations for a place that could heal not only bodies but also spirits. As he read, he could hear Stanley's voice in his mind, telling him to carry on the work they had started together. The transition. In the days following the memorial, the center became a hive of activity. The leadership team, donors, and volunteers rallied together, determined to honor Stanley by ensuring the center's continued success. Maya, though grieving, threw herself into the work. Her father's legacy was now hers to protect, and she felt an overwhelming responsibility to see it flourish. Ethan, too, took on more than ever before. He wasn't just a doctor or a consultant anymore. He was a leader. Together with Maya, he worked tirelessly to stabilize the center's operations during the transition. Meetings with stakeholders, planning sessions, and late-night strategy discussions became their new normal. One evening, as they sat in the center's conference room reviewing the latest expansion plans, Maya paused, her pen hovering over the paper. "Do you think he knew?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked up from his notes. "Knew what?" "That he did enough," Maya said, her eyes glistening with unused tears. "That he didn't have to carry it all by himself anymore. That we would take care of this place." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "I think he did. he said after a moment. The last few months, I saw something in him, a kind of peace. I think he finally let himself believe that it was okay to let go, to trust that we carry it forward. Maya nodded, wiping her eyes. I just wish I could tell him again. Tell him how much he meant to me, to all of us. Ethan reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on hers. He knew, Maya. He always knew. Carrying the torch. The center continued to grow in ways that exceeded even Stanley's and Anne's wildest dreams. The medical wing expanded to include a trauma care unit, and the education wing partnered with local universities to provide scholarships for young students who had once been part of the center's programs. The community area now hosted workshops on everything from vocational training to mental health support, empowering people to rebuild their lives with dignity and hope. Ethan and Maya became the faces of the center's mission, speaking at conferences, fundraising galas, and community events. They shared the story of Stanley and Anne, not just as a way to inspire support, but as a reminder of the power of compassion and resilience. Every time they spoke, they could feel Stanley's presence with them, guiding their words, reminding them why they had started this journey. But the work wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when funding ran low, when bureaucratic obstacles threatened to stall their progress, and when the emotional toll of the work weighed heavily on their hearts. In those moments, Ethan and Maya leaned on each other, finding strength in their shared purpose. Late one evening, after a particularly grueling day, Ethan and Maya sat together in the garden behind the center. The night was cool, and the stars shone brightly overhead. Do you ever feel like we're not doing enough? Maya asked, her voice tinged with doubt. Ethan turned to her, surprised. What do you mean? Maya sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. There's so much more we could do. More people we could help, more programs we could create. Sometimes it feels like we're only scratching the surface. Ethan considered her words, his gaze thoughtful. Stanley once told me something, he said after a moment. He said it's not about fixing everything. It's about doing what you can, with what you have, and doing it with all your heart. That's enough. It has to be. Maya nodded, her expression softening. He was right, wasn't he? He always was, Ethan said with a small smile. A new chapter. A year later, the center celebrated its second anniversary. The event was even larger than the first, with hundreds of people gathering to honor the work that had been done and to look toward the future. Ethan and Maya stood side by side on the stage, addressing the crowd with a mix of gratitude and determination. This center is more than just a place, Maya said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. It's a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of community, and the legacy of two incredible people, my parents, Stanley and Anne. Their vision lives on in every life touched by this center, and it will continue to inspire us for generations to come. Ethan stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. Stanley once told me that hope isn't something you find. It's something you build. And that's what we're doing here. Together, we're building hope, one life at a time. The applause that followed was deafening, a standing ovation that lasted long after Ethan and Maya had stepped off the stage. In the crowd, families embraced, children cheered, and volunteers beamed with pride. A legacy fulfilled. Years later, the Ann Walker Humanitarian Center had grown into a global movement. Centers inspired by its model were established in countries around the world, each one carrying forward the principles of compassion, healing, and community. Ethan and Maya remained at the heart of the effort, their bond deepened by their shared journey. On the anniversary of Stanley's passing, they returned to the original center. Together, they stood in the garden, now a lush and vibrant space filled with flowers and benches where people could find peace. A plaque near the entrance bore Stanley's words, "Hope isn't something you find. It's something you build." Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out Anne's notebook. It had become a symbol of their mission, a reminder of where it all began. "He'd be proud of us," Maya said, her voice quiet but resolute. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the plaque. "He'd be proud of you." As they stood there, the wind rustling the leaves and the sun casting a warm glow over the garden, they knew that Stanley's legacy was not just in the buildings, the programs, or even the people they had helped. It was in the spirit of the work, the belief that even in the face of unimaginable loss, hope could endure. And as they walked back into the center, ready to face the challenges of the future, they carried that legacy with them, knowing that the seeds Stanley and Anne had planted would continue to grow, touching lives in ways they could only begin to imagine.